Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the Lady Wallis Budge Symposium, Cross College, and Dr. Lokchenov to offer me my first participation in a research meeting. When we talk about funerary iconography in ancient Egypt, we have in mind a very specific and precise set of images, themes, and figures. From the 3rd dynasty onwards, we have kept evidence of many decorative programs whose purpose was to offer the right environment to the deceased, to praise his way of life, and to create a religious area where cult was to be accomplished. The first impression that we have is that the tombs show a perfect and ideal world. Everything is at its right place, and the world shown is structured by the notion of Ma'at, as well order, as justice, as perfection. However, this general goal does not prevent this iconography from representing some inconvenient and abnormal behaviors. As Pascal Vernus noted, the ideology of Ma'at implicates a tendency to deviate, to escape from brief moment the perfect organization, only to be later punished and reintegrated in the order. That means that we do not have to take the funerary scenes as a perfect and intangible cosmos, but as a dynamic field where the order, embodied by the administrator, representing the king, is enforced on the rest of the population. We believe that the ideas developed by Michel Foucault in his lectures in the Collège de France in the 70s can be useful here. He developed especially the notion of disciplinary institution, to speak about psychiatric hospitals and prisons, but also administrations and schools. What is a disciplinary institution or control device, according to Michel Foucault? The term describes specific spaces where the individuals are submitted to a double process of domination and acculturation. In our case, we are more interested by the second aspect of acculturation, domination being a consequence of this acculturation. In these institutions, among which jail can be seen as a model, a constant control is put on people by an authority, and this control is the very aim of the institution. The control applies, of course, to the movements of the individuals, but also their gestures, their habits, and their thoughts. The aim is to create what Bourdieu called an habitus, that conforms to the vision a dominant group wants or needs for the population targeted. It is therefore impossible to dissociate it from social strategies to enforce the domination of a group upon another. In the case of our iconography, we of course do not have an institution which directly controls individuals, but as well as modern TV can be seen as a way through which a socially and politically motivated way of life is praised, tomb images have social cultural effects and impact those who see them. This is justified by two facts. First, at any period of Egyptian history, an important number of people visited the tomb of officials, of course the family, estate members, but also artists seeking inspiration, colleagues, etc. Second, only a very tiny elite was able to build a decorated tomb. The possession of a tomb is often described as a favor of the king. The group of tomb owners is consequently quite homogeneous, defined by its capacity to assemble wealth and his link to the king. We can assume that, at each distinct period, the ideology of this elite was quite homogeneous and not shared uniformly by the rest of the population. The funerary programs can be seen as places where non-elite people saw themselves as they were supposed to be, according to official ideology. So we follow this interpretation, but it does not contradict other perspectives, such as daily life interpretation or religious visions. This cultural purpose has many aspects, and today, as in our ongoing PhD research, we are going to focus on two specific themes: rendering of accounts and punishments. But in a few words, we can evoke some of other ways control is transfigured on stone, such as on this wall from Ptahhotep's tomb. First, the omnipresence of a dead owner, whose body, larger than the rest, reminds everyone that he is not only the center of the tomb, but also the reason for everybody to be there. Second, The vast majority of people are working. Very few scenes of non-elite people are shown, such as drinking, eating, sleeping, or just chatting. The integration into art for individuals happens by working. Third, many activities include an idea of control. It is the case for hunting and fishing scenes, especially birding with a net, but also butchery, for example. And fourth, more specifically, the human body is submitted to a process of control. Numerous scenes show people dancing, hunting, fishing, and particularly wrestling. These images create an orthopraxy for the audience, differentiating good ways to use one's body and bad. From now on, we are going to focus on two specific aspects of control in funerary contexts: punishment and rendering of accounts. A few details first about our sources. Today we will only speak about evidence from the Old Kingdom. We do, however, have testimonies from the Middle and New Kingdoms, but for this intervention, I think more conclusive to focus on the 3rd millennium. It's a period when we have the most numerous scenes of control. I, for the moment, have collected a body of 63 tombs, of which 48 date from the Old Kingdom. The first punishment and rendering of account scenes both appear during the 4th dynasty, but the 5th is clearly the climax of these scenes, with no less than 30 tombs, almost one half of our whole body of pieces of evidence. These scenes also come from quite a large range of tombs. As we said, some come from the very high officials of the court in Memphis, such as the huge tombs of Ti and Mereruka in Saqqara, and others from middle elite officials or high officials from provinces, such as chiefs of districts. I will begin with the rendering of accounts, and later I will speak about punishments. This expression, rendering of accounts, or reddition de comptes in French, has been coined anciently for Egyptian tombs, to speak about a particular ceremony whose form remained quite unchanged from the 4th to the 12th dynasty. I will first focus on the first and most ancient scenes of the body of sources. The first occurrence that you can see here on the PowerPoint dates from the reign of Rajadef in the 4th dynasty in the Giza tomb of Seneb. Seneb was director of the weaving of the palace and supervisor of the dwarfs, being himself a dwarf. The two scenes are thematically linked. On the bottom we have the rendering of accounts. You can note that this is the first occurrence, and we have already the 3 protagonists. To the left, a scribe is sitting and writing. He is probably interrogating the man seated in front of him. The 2 people in the middle are brought to the court, here just one scribe, to be investigated. We'll call them controlled. To the right, an armed guard puts his hand on the controlled's head. We'll call him officer. These 2 scenes on the wall are linked. We have every reason to believe that the scribe standing on the top register is the same that is sitting in the bottom one. This is confirmed by the inscription. On the bottom, Heseb Sa'u, calculate the herdsmen, so calculate about the herdsmen. On the top, Inet Iru, do the cattle tax. So on a realistic level, we can think that first the workers of the estate were inspected by a bureau of scribes. Then those scribes did their report for the estate owner. Furthermore, in terms of semiotics, the presence of the same wall of these 2 scenes suggests that the presence of the owner is essential to any kind of control. The 2 actions that were probably linked in a distant temporality are here combined on the same wall. The presence of the owner, sitting at a kiosk with his 2 dogs, showing his power with his chair, legitimates the control of the scribes and the 2 men below. We can make 2 other observations on this precise relief. First, you can see the 2 herdsmen are almost bald, whereas the other characters have perfect hair. While not very frequent, it's one of the processes through which legitimacy is opposed to submission in rendering of account scenes. Second, here the 2 controlled are herdsmen. It's possible there's a link with the owner's title of Director of the Weaving. It is our opinion that this first occurrence of the rendering of accounts was born as a depiction of a real activity of the owner who had to check herdsmen for clothes. The second oldest scene comes from the tomb of Queen Merci-Andre III, wife of Khafre. Here the queen is just above the scene, much taller on the right, and her presence gives a hint of control and legitimacy to the entire wall. The scene is more developed than Seneb's. 5 scribes are writing under the supervision of what seems to be the chief of the bureau. One officer with a stick drives a man before them, whereas 4 are waiting their turn seating. So who are the protagonists? First, on the right, the scribes. They're called here Judjat and Perjet, the high court of the estate of eternity. A Judjat is, during the Old Kingdom, a court managing any institution, combining administrative and judicial occupations. The scribes work for the owner as representative and help him manage the estate. Here, the Perjet, the estate of eternity, is twofold. On the one hand, it evokes the real estate given by the king to an official, but it's also the fictional estate represented on the tomb to provide the owner with food and offerings for eternity. Second, the officers. The main one is standing in the middle with a stick in his hand. It's not proper to call them police officers. The only term used in our body of evidence is sa père, so literally son of the estate, in 4 tombs. They were private guards working for the dignitary or his estate. They were specialized in the management of workers. Finally, the controlled man. So we saw in Seneb's tomb they were herdsmen, but here, who are them? The more frequent term is Heka, so chief, or Hekahut, so chief of the estate, with 14 occurrences in our body of evidence. It is not here our purpose to explore the different hypotheses on their status, but what is clear is that they are controlling officials, not mere workers such as peasants or craftsmen. They are responsible for teams of workers. So the Bureau of Scribes does not directly investigate mere workers in the fields or workshops, but those controlling them. On a practical basis, it shows that the official control went through intermediaries and that dignitaries needed some local intelligence. But here it also shows everybody that even the little title bearers are controlled. So you see that early in the 4th dynasty, the codes of the rendering of accounts were established, and they did not change a lot, neither during the 5th nor the 6th dynasty. So how are control and submission marked into stone? It's first a matter of defining categories. So we are just going to list here some ways of defining categories. We saw on Seneb's wall a difference in hairstyle. Maybe we can assume that baldness can be seen as a symbolic evocation of incompleteness, opposed to a perfect hairstyle or wig. We have the same opposition here in Akhretep's classic representation, but also Uhemka, Nyochnum, or others. The controlled people are opposed to scribes, and this opposition uses what Michel Foucault coined knowledge effects. That is, their social position is reinforced by the mastering of techniques and knowledge, such as writing and counting. The verb heseb, which means to count, is present in 8 tombs, where we also have 3 for sesh, to write, and 3 for ip, to count. The object of these 3 verbs is always hekau, so the chiefs, so directly people. The control of the administration and the workers is possible thanks to technical skills. What is at stake here is an ordering of the estate and in a larger perspective of Egyptian countryside. The position of the scribes is also reinforced by some symbolic organization. You can see here in Sabduhotep's tomb the first occurrence of the column hall, which is quite rare, but we also have 3 other evidence in our body of sources. The verticality of the columns is opposed to the oblique lines formed by the controlled. One word, that of the scribes, is more stable than the others. The other group that is opposed to the controlled is the officers. Their function is shown by their stick, that we can see in 25 tombs. The remaining are probably lost and were drawn in the first place. Sometimes ended with a hand, as here in Thévement's tomb. Such as the writing equipment for the scribes, the stick distinguishes the officials from the rest of the population. The instrument obviously isn't neutral. The possibility of violence contributes to the status. Even if we do not have evidence of Saqqara beating people, the potential violence against those disobeying is present on the wall. But control is not just an abstract problem, so I will briefly focus on physical aspects of submission. First, if you go back to Matthieu's tomb, we see two lines of people, with on the right 5 scribes sitting and 4 controlled on the left. The scribes are not overcrowded. They respect social distancing, everyone with the same gesture, the head in the same direction, with only very tiny differences concerning their hands. On the contrary, the 4 chiefs controlled on the left are very close to each other, the one's knee or foot touching his front neighbor. 2 are looking before them and 2 are looking behind, and each has a different arm position. That cannot be a coincidence. The group of chiefs is depicted as disorganized and unstable, whereas the scribes are perfectly ordered. The hearing of workers before the judges is a way to order the formless groups of workers. We see there the ordering function of administration, not just checking counts, but also imposing a way of behaving as a disciplinary institution, as we said earlier. The second point about physical control is what officers do to controlled people. In Architect's tomb, you can see the opposition between officers standing right and chiefs who are bowing. The chiefs are forced to bow. Here, one lightly, the others at 90-degree angle. So we can see how is imposed a natural position for the body, even a prowess, when you walk like this and you have to talk to a jury like this. The officers put their hand on the neck or the head of the controlled. They have mastered specific skills and techniques of physical control. So that's the first side of physical control, distorting the body. An impression of pain is felt when looking at this. We consider it as a form of violence and the imposition of domination on people. A second aspect is that it makes people do what you want them to do. The verb used here is inet, to bring, that is present in 6 different tombs. The officers control the movements of the workers, and their job is to make them go from one place to another. That is, here from the workplace to the court. So ini, to bring, is with hesep, to calculate, one of the 2 major verbs that describe the rendering of accounts. The rendering of accounts is based on the fact of mastering the movements of people, checking them, and finally changing their habits. That will be our final point in this first part. The controlled walking with specific arm positions. You can see here in this relief. There are some variations. The arms are either folded or just hang on the legs, or one folded and one hanging. These attitudes all show humility and contrition. No hand or elbow points outwards or threatens anyone. You can see here a real orthopraxy for controlled people. So, to conclude this part, the rendering of account is one of the classic Old Kingdom funerary themes, where an ideology of control is developed and workers are acculturated. It works as a disciplinary place because it shows everyone that the institutions of the estate, representing the owner and hence the king, are watching everything and have the means to submit the inferiors. The other aspect of control is punishment. The body of punishment scenes is clearly smaller than that of the rendering of accounts. We have kept 15 scenes from the Old Kingdom, of which 3 are associated to rendering of accounts. So it is quite a rare theme, which also remains enigmatic in many ways. However, I must remind you that many sins are controversial because the punishment is not always easily recognized. So it is very likely other sins have disappeared. We can divide them into 3 categories. The first category of this typology is spanking. It is the most frequent, with 7 occurrences at least and 1 dubious. It's also the oldest, probably appearing during the 4th dynasty and only seen during the 4th and the 5th. We must not be mistaken by some modern cultural prejudices, such as those made by some of the tomb publishers who interpreted them as children's education. It's so frequent and homogeneous a sin to not be seen as coherent. Indeed, we find the same elements in different tombs, such as phrases and characters. The scenes are organized with 3 characters: the punished, the punisher, and the supervisor. On this relief from Nimatri's tomb, you can distinguish the 3 figures. On the right, a punished man is kneeling, whereas a standing man spanks him with his hand. This scheme is seen coherently in the different tombs, with 2 variations. First, the punisher can stand in a more or less straight way, or, like here, lean towards his victim. And the victim is here resisting, waving his arm against the other, but some are also represented as passive and obedient. The third character is the supervisor. He is always standing, leaning on a staff in a calm attitude. He is sometimes half-bald, which emphasizes an age difference. What does it represent? We can be clear that it is not a judicial act, more something as management of work. These scenes are always in a productive context, surrounded by agricultural activities, and strangely so, often in the context of cattle breeding in the marches. So it's not a consequence of a trial. Apart from the supervisor's presence, nothing marks it as official and important. But it's neither just children playing or being punished by an adult. 2 reasons. Nothing would particularly explain why here children are being taken care of. But especially, there is a title-bearing official who in several tombs ordered the punisher to beat the victim, like here in Ptahhotep's tomb, asking that it be strong. That doesn't match with children rearing. So we must assume that some workers are being punished for an unknown mistake, but probably something regarding their work. In 2 tombs, the supervisor is said Chirep Meniu, so supervisor of herdsmen. So he's responsible for a team of workers and thus can chastise them when they made errors. The repetition of sentences like beat him hard, like here in Ptahhotep's tomb, makes us think that the spanking did not have only symbolic aspects. That is mostly a modern interpretation, but it was quite painful. It is nevertheless quite difficult to go further. We'll be short about the second category, bastinado, that is, beating with a stick or a whip. It appears during the 5th dynasty and continues during the 6th, but most scenes are incomplete. The first scene we have here comes from Inti's tomb, from the 5th dynasty, and is still inside a context of breeding work, so a link with spanking is possible. The most famous bastinado comes from Abbas or Ibi's tomb in Der Gebrawi, from Pepi II's reign. I don't have time to analyze it in details, but you can observe that it's not anymore a question of management inside a team of workers. First, on the top register, there is a rendering of accounts going on, with scribes checking the counts of directors of cattle. On the bottom register, there's the bastinado, who is, to my opinion, a judicial punishment inflicted after the people have been condemned by the court. In all cases, it has few in common with the spanking scenes, which were isolated and non-judicial. Here the rendering of accounts explains the punishment, which needs at least 3 people to hold the hands and feet of the victim, and 1 to beat him. We also note that the punisher holds 2 hand sticks, so the same the sauper were holding during a rendering of accounts. So the same people working for the Bureau of Scribes lead the inspection of workers on the one hand, and then punish those who are judged guilty. We have every reason here to think that it was a particularly harsh punishment. The last type of punishment is very famous and is found only in two tombs, which have so many details in common that it seems very unlikely one didn't imitate the other. It's the pillory in Meroruca's and Khentika's tombs from the 6th dynasty. The scenes are complex and many things have been written about them, so I won't be long. I will only do some remarks. First, it is associated to a rendering of accounts, so after several generations of alone standing scenes, the inspection of workers can be followed by a negative consequence. It's clear that here the person attached to the pillory has been deemed guilty and condemned by the scribes on the left. Second, it's a harsh beating, but not an execution. It seems today clear that the men won't be beheaded. So, we can ask ourselves what these scenes of punishment mean inside the decorative program. It is striking that rendering of accounts and punishment scenes appeared separately and joined finally several generations later during the 6th dynasty. We can provide three explanations. The first is sociological. The three tombs where the two are linked belong to very high officials, 2 viziers and 1 director of district and director of Upper Egypt. It required great power and confidence to show his own agents beating workers. Second, on the other hand, there has been some reluctance of the artists to represent harsh punishments because the tombs had to show an ideal world that would accompany the deceased through eternity. So the spanking scenes are represented among other moments of the worker's everyday life, and it seems quite a mild punishment compared to a bastinado. The absence of capital executions, which we know existed at this time, can also be explained by a taboo for harsh violence's depiction. And finally, this is coherent with our interpretation that control is the central goal in funerary scenes. The choice of representing rendering of accounts is legitimate in itself, the goal being that inferiors know they are being checked and observed all the time. The rendering of accounts do not need punishments to be effective. Their point is to show control enacted by the authority on people. So what are their punishment scenes? Though we cannot leave out a realistic interpretation, we think that physical punishment is used here as an example of body submission. The simple situation of someone beating another establishes a mere social fact. Some are given punishments and others are giving them. This distinguishing line, based on the potential violence that can be inflicted to anyone, creates a social order. In Egypt, legitimate violence is not an absolute that would be the property of a single group, such as the police, but it's relational. A violence is legitimate when, among other things, it's used by a superior on an inferior. So the infrequency of punishment scenes must not mislead us. They show the power any superior has on his inferiors. During the 5th dynasty, no tomb owner dared to have his own gods chastise people, so the punishments remained a management of labor problem. One last thing. We never know what these people did that justifies their punishment. The total absence of any inscription about it is no chance. What matters here is not the chain of consequences leading from one crime to one punishment, but the fact that any possible misdeed will be seen and dealt with. The punishment scenes do not conceal the crime that justifies them, but their purpose in themselves is that they are images of control. So that brings us back to the idea of control that justifies the presence of punishment scenes. So today I spoke about two types of scenes inside the funerary iconography, rendering of accounts and punishments, that use violence to control people. But it's our opinion that we can take this analyzed further. The tomb decorations worked as disciplinary institutions. One of their long-term goals was to legitimize the domination of an elite and submit the rest of the population. It served a purpose of acculturation in a not totally pacified society and praised a certain vision of social order. I thank you all for your attention.